So now that we know a bunch of information about programming languages and how and where to write them, along with the print statement under our belts, let's go over some intuitive things that the computer can do all by itself, without you having to tell it how to. More specifically, we'll be covering some basic number mathematics as well as string math. Starting off with basic mathematics, the computer already knows how to do simple arithmetic. This includes addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, all of which are represented by the symbols shown on the screen now. In any IDE that you may install, you'll be able to print out the answer to simple math problems using the print statement, which may seem counterintuitive because why would you use the computer to do math when you have a perfectly good calculator on your phone? But you have to remember that computers are dumb, and anything we want a computer to do, we have to build up from scratch. Basic arithmetic, while simple, helps out in almost any program you may write. For example, if we wanted to build a basic calculator app, we'd need to utilize this functionality in order to correctly display the answer to an arithmetic problem when our user tries to add, subtract, multiply, or divide two numbers. Now, in addition to the four basic math equations, most programming languages include an additional operator known as modulus. If this is your first time hearing this word, don't worry, since it's not usually taught in math classes. Modulus allows us to get the remainder of a divisional operation. For example, when we take 10 modulus 3, we are essentially telling the computer to take 10, divide it by 3, ignore the actual answer, and just give us the remainder of the operation, in this case 1. Since when we divide 10 by 1, the answer is 3 remainder 1. The 1 in this case is what gets printed out to the console. If there is no remainder, say in the case that we take 50 modulus 2, since the remainder is 0, the function would return 0 if we were to print it out to the console. This can be extremely useful in many cases, the most obvious being if we want to determine whether or not a certain integer is even or odd. If we take a certain number, modulus 2, and it returns 0, then we know that is even, because any number divided by 2 will always result in a full answer without a remainder. But if the system returns 1, then we know that the integer is odd. You will find yourself using the basic math operators a lot more than you think, so it's good to keep them in mind when writing your program. Now, not only can our computer work with numbers, but it can also work with strings. Strings, by the way, are just another way to say text. For example, hello world is a string, the letter A is a string, and anything enclosed by quotation marks is denoted as a string in programming languages. We'll cover more about strings in a bit when we talk about variables, but for now, let's continue. We already talked about printing strings to the console, but let's say we're making a game, and we wanted to print out the statement, game over. 4 was your final score. Now, while we could just make a string that says that exact phrase and print it out to the console, in some cases it would be more useful to print out the actual integer value, especially in the case of a game where the score can change each time you play, because score definitely isn't always going to be 4. Well, we're also able to print out multiple strings of text, and even integers, by adding them together in the print statement. This is known as concatenation. Continuing with our score example, if we wanted to print out the statement, game over, 4 was your final score, using 4 as an integer rather than a string, we could do this by breaking down the statement into two strings and an integer like so. Print game over plus 4 plus was your final score. We of course begin with the print statement, which again will be different across all languages, but in this case we're using Python. Inside the print statement, we start off by printing the string game over. Now here comes the important part. From there, we use a plus sign and add 4 to the print statement, just like if you were adding two numbers. Then we can repeat this process with another plus sign for the final string was your final score, and we're able to print out the entirety of our statement easily. Doing this, we can easily print out multiple different strings and integers together in one print statement. We could also combine the two lessons we've learned thus far and do something such as game over plus 4 plus was your final score. In the case, let's say, where you have a game which gives you a base score and then 4 points for a certain task that you completed. This demonstration also displays another important part of programming, which is that oftentimes, to get your program to be the most efficient, you have to combine aspects of code. Now, it's important to note that the computer will take whatever you put in the parentheses and print it out, character for character. So oftentimes, programmers will forget to add a space onto the end of their strings. This can result in a small mistake in which the string from the previous example would be printed out as if to say, game over 4 was your final score, which isn't that appealing when displayed on the screen to the user. So it's a good practice to always put a space after and before your strings to make sure this doesn't happen and your string doesn't end up like that. Another important thing to note is the difference between for in quotation marks and for without quotation marks. Now, for in quotation marks is treated as a string rather than a for without quotation marks, which is treated as a number. This may not seem like a big deal, but again, computers are dumb, and if you try to do math with a number in quotation marks, it will return an error because the computer doesn't understand that you're trying to perform the operation on a number, and it thinks you're trying to add an integer to a string, which is a big no-no in programming when you're adding numbers. So when you're programming, make sure to make a mental note of whether or not you want to make something an integer or a string, because that type of stuff makes a big difference. Alright, that concludes our segment on the base power of computers.